The year was 1887, when Martha Stokes first appeared in the remote mountains of western Montana Territory carrying little more than a worn leather satchel and what locals described as an unusual collection of modified carpentry tools. The arrival of a lone woman to stake a claim raised eyebrows among the scattered homesteaders of Bitterroot Valley, but Martha's quiet determination silenced most objections. What none could have predicted was how her unorthodox approach to cabin construction would eventually save lives during one of the harshest winters ever recorded in the territory. Martha purchased a small plot of land near the eastern ridge, paying cash from funds she'd saved working as a furniture maker's assistant in Pennsylvania. The plot wasn't prime, rocky soil with a steep grade that others had passed over, but it featured a natural spring and stood protected from the prevailing winds by a granite outcropping. Not where most would choose to build, noted James Harmon, the general store proprietor, in his business ledger. But she insisted on that particular parcel, despite better options being available. The transaction itself generated considerable interest. Women rarely purchased frontier property independently, particularly in remote mountain regions. County records preserved in the Ravalli Historical Archives indicate Martha paid $35 for the 12-acre parcel, slightly above market rate, suggesting her determination to secure that specific location. When questioned about her choice, Martha reportedly answered with practicality. The water runs year-round, the southern exposure maximizes winter light, and the granite shields against the northern winds. I'm not paying for today's convenience, but for January's survival. Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found the story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The peculiarities of Martha's behavior began with her preparations. While most settlers rushed to erect basic shelter before winter, Martha spent nearly 3 weeks simply observing the land. She constructed a temporary lean-to against the granite face, and was seen taking extensive measurements, making diagrams, and collecting soil samples from different areas of her property. Harmon's ledger shows her first purchases included a surveyor's compass, detailed notebooks, and graphite pencils, items rarely prioritized by settlers facing the urgent need for shelter. Those initial weeks established a pattern that would define Martha's approach. Each morning at dawn, she traversed her property in expanding spirals, making notes about drainage patterns, soil composition, and wind flow across the terrain. Local hunter Samuel Tucker, whose trapping route passed nearby, reported observing her placing small flags at various points, then recording the movement of shadows throughout the day. Never seen someone study land with such attention, he noted in correspondence to his brother. Like she's reading a book that's written in the dirt and trees? Martha's deliberate pace stood in stark contrast to the typical frontier rush. Most new arrivals to the valley focused on immediate shelter and clearing land for basic crops. Their approach followed established patterns: erect a basic cabin using green timber, expand gradually as time and resources allowed, and hope the structure would withstand winter conditions while making hasty repairs as needed. This method, while expedient, often resulted in drafty dwellings that required constant maintenance and excessive firewood to remain habitable during harsh winters. This methodical approach drew ridicule from neighbors. "The woman's mapping dirt while there's timber to cut," remarked Frederick Denton, whose own cabin stood a mile downhill. The summer of 1887 was particularly mild, fostering a sense of ease among the valley's residents. Most focused on expanding their holdings or pursuing social connections rather than winterproofing. Martha, however, maintained her measured pace, undeterred by occasional laughter when she visited town. Such dismissals were common in frontier settlements where physical labor and visible progress were highly valued. The Territorial Register, a weekly newspaper serving the region, reflected this attitude in a short item: from August 1887. The bachelor woman of East Ridge continues her peculiar study of rocks and dirt, though not a log has yet been laid for her dwelling. Winter comes, whether ready or not, as many a greenhorn has learned to their sorrow. The condescension in such accounts was thinly veiled, particularly regarding a woman undertaking a project typically considered men's work. Martha's visits to town revealed a woman of few words but clear purpose. Harmon's store ledger from this period shows regular, carefully planned purchases. Specific tools, including an unusual broadaxe with modified handle, a set of Swedish augers, and several woodworking implements more commonly associated with furniture making than frontier construction. She supplemented these with reference materials, a subscription to Scientific American, a treatise on wood properties published by the Department of Agriculture, and a book on European alpine construction techniques from the previous century. By late August, when Martha finally began felling trees, her neighbors had already completed their basic structures. What drew attention was her selection process. She passed over dozens of seemingly suitable trees, marking only specific ones with precise measurements recorded in her notebook. Elias Cooper, a passing timber scout, observed her rejecting several straight pines in favor of ones with particular growth patterns. "She's looking for compression wood," he noted in correspondence to his employer, selecting for grain pattern rather than appearance, not common practice for cabin builders, but standard in fine furniture making. Cooper's observations proved insightful. Martha's notebooks, later preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, reveal detailed analysis of wood properties based on growth patterns, sun exposure, and even the soil in which trees had grown. North Slope pine with tight grain shows 30% less expansion at contraction cycle compared to valley specimen, reads one entry. Essential for critical structural elements where dimensional stability matters. Such considerations were virtually unheard of in frontier construction, where expediency typically trumped material science. The technical knowledge Martha displayed raised questions about her background. Records from the Pennsylvania Furniture Makers Guild, discovered during research for a 1964 exhibition on frontier women, indicate that Martha had indeed worked for 7 years under master craftsman Thomas Wilcox in Pittsburgh. Guild documents describe her as exceptionally skilled in structural joinery and wood selection, though limited in her advancement by gender restrictions. This apprenticeship, typically closed to women, apparently came through family connections. Wilcox was her maternal uncle, who had no sons to continue his craft. The physical labor of felling and processing timber single-handedly highlighted Martha's determination and resourcefulness. Tucker's journal entries mention observing her using mechanical advantage rather than brute strength. The woman has rigged pulleys and levers that let her move logs that would normally require 2 strong men. Clever system using counterweights and inclined skids. Takes longer than a team would, but she manages what should be impossible for one person working alone. The first true indicator of Martha's impossible trick came when she began processing the timber. Instead of the traditional method of stacking freshly cut logs to dry, she created what locals called her sun calendar, a circular arrangement of logs positioned in relation to the sun's path. Each log was elevated off the ground on stone supports and rotated at specific intervals noted in her journal. This technique, requiring significant physical effort for one person, puzzled observers. This method, later analyzed by forestry experts from the University of Montana in 1932, accelerated the controlled drying process while preventing the cracking and warping common in frontier lumber. Martha's journal entries from this period include detailed observations on moisture content and dimensional changes. "Standard practice loses valuable time," she wrote. "Green wood assembled into walls continues drying for months, creating gaps as joints shrink. My method achieves partial seasoning before assembly, allowing for precise joinery that remains stable." The technical sophistication of Martha's approach became increasingly apparent. She constructed a small testing apparatus that measured the shrinkage rates of different wood samples under controlled conditions. Her journals document a systematic experimentation process, comparing various treatment methods and their effects on the timber's properties. Entries include precise measurements recorded to fractions of an inch, calculations of moisture content, and observations about structural integrity under various stress tests. September brought the first suggestion of an early winter. Unusual cold snaps frosted the valley twice, and heavy cloud formations appeared over the western peaks. Most settlers took notice, but made only cursory preparations, checking roof integrity, gathering moderate firewood supplies. Martha, however, intensified her work. Store records show purchases of additional iron tools, linseed oil, and beeswax. Her unconventional log treatment continued, with neighbors observing her applying mixtures to the wood and covering certain sections with canvas overnight. The treatments Martha employed combined traditional woodworking knowledge with techniques she had apparently developed through experimentation. Analysis of wood samples preserved from her cabin, conducted during its 1954 restoration, revealed a complex mixture of natural resins, beeswax, and linseed oil that penetrated the wood fibers to enhance stability and water resistance. More remarkably, she applied these treatments selectively based on each piece's eventual position in the structure. Heavier applications on corner joints and areas exposed to weather, lighter treatments on interior elements. Martha's preparations extended beyond the timber itself. She excavated an unusually deep foundation, lining it with carefully selected stones arranged in patterns that distributed weight evenly and provided drainage. This technique, similar to methods used in alpine regions of Europe but rare in American frontier construction, created a stable base that resisted the ground heaving that often damaged cabins during freeze-thaw cycles. When Frederick Denton questioned the need for such extensive foundation work, Martha reportedly replied, "The ground moves in winter. Either your foundation accommodates this fact, or your walls crack by February." What truly set Martha's technique apart was revealed when actual construction began in early October. Rather than building with green timber or partially dried logs, as was common practice, her treated wood had specific qualities that allowed for tight-fitting joints without the usual shrinkage problems that plagued new cabins. The most remarkable aspect, however, was her joining technique. Instead of traditional notching, Martha employed a modified dovetail system adapted from furniture making that allowed her to assemble wall sections on the ground before raising them. The precision of these joints required significant skill. Traditional log cabin construction used simple saddle notches or dovetails cut directly as each log was placed. Martha's approach demanded that every joint be precisely measured and cut before assembly, with each log numbered according to its position in the finished structure. Her notebooks contain detailed scale drawings of each connection, with measurements noted to 16th-inch precision. This level of planning was virtually unknown in frontier building, where approximation and on-the-spot adjustment were standard practice. "She's building it flat," noted Cooper in a subsequent letter, "assembling whole walls, horizontal-like, before standing them up. Never seen it done that way with logs this size." This approach, while requiring careful preparation, dramatically reduced the need for assistance during crucial stages of construction. Where traditional methods required multiple people to position each log, Martha could raise entire pre-assembled wall sections using a clever system of pulleys and counterweights she'd designed herself. The ingenuity of Martha's pulley system deserves particular attention. Using principles of mechanical advantage, she created a framework of wooden beams, rope pulleys, and stone counterweights that allowed her to gradually raise entire wall sections weighing hundreds of pounds. The system, documented in technical drawings found among her papers, incorporated safety mechanisms that prevented accidental drops and allowed her to secure each position before advancing to the next stage. This approach effectively transformed what had always been a community effort into a task manageable by a single determined individual. Martha's mechanical aptitude extended beyond the pulley system itself. She developed specialized tools for specific tasks, modifying standard implements to provide better leverage or precision. Her notebooks include detailed drawings of these adaptations, a modified broad axe with an offset handle that improved cutting angles while reducing strain, a specialized gauge for ensuring consistent notch depths, and a remarkable adjustable jig that helped maintain perfect alignment when boring holes for wooden pegs that would reinforce critical joints. The first snow fell on October 23rd, unusually early and heavier than expected. Most settlers viewed it as an anomaly rather than a harbinger. "Just a dusty reminder to finish up those repairs," wrote Harmon in his journal. "The real winter's still 6 weeks off." This complacency was widespread. Records from the nearby Fort Missoula weather station indicate that the previous 3 winters had been mild, leading to what one officer called a dangerous casualness among the civilian population. This collective underestimation of winter's threat was a common pattern in newly established frontier communities. Army meteorological records from Fort Missoula reveal that the territory experienced cyclical weather patterns, with periods of mild winters often followed by extreme conditions. A report filed by Lieutenant William Chambers in 1885 warned that civilian settlers frequently base preparations on recent experience rather than historical patterns, creating vulnerability during inevitable severe seasons. This report, tragically prescient, had circulated only among military personnel and never reached the general population. Martha's response to the early snow stood in stark contrast. She accelerated her work schedule, often continuing by lantern light well after dark. Her pulley system allowed her to raise the final wall section just 3 days after the first snowfall. Visitors noted that while her cabin appeared smaller than most, its proportions seemed carefully calculated. The roof pitch was steeper than typical designs, the eaves extended further, and the foundation incorporated stone in a pattern usually seen in higher mountain elevations. The dimensions of the cabin, recorded during its 1954 dismantling, revealed Martha's practical approach to spatial efficiency. At approximately 16 by 24 feet, the structure was more compact than many frontier dwellings, which often expanded haphazardly as time and resources permitted. However, every aspect of the design maximized functionality. The steep 12x12 roof pitch effectively shed snow while creating usable loft space. Extended eaves protected walls from moisture and provided covered storage areas. Interior layouts detailed in her notebooks show careful consideration of heat flow patterns, daily movement paths, and work requirements. Martha's attention to weatherproofing went far beyond frontier norms. Between log courses, she installed a combination of moss, clay, and fiber material in a precise layering system that created an effective air and moisture barrier. Analysis during the cabin's restoration revealed that this chinking method, combined with her precise joinery, created an envelope significantly more airtight than typical construction of the era. Modern testing conducted in 1956 estimated that her design reduced heat loss by approximately 60% compared to standard frontier cabins of similar size. November brought confirmation of what Martha seemed to have anticipated. A second storm hit on the 7th, dropping 18 inches of snow and ushering in a cold snap that froze the smaller streams. The settlers' initial nonchalance gave way to concerned activity. Frederick Denton recorded in his personal journal, "This early freeze wasn't in anyone's calculations, men rushing to finish what should have been done weeks ago. The Palmer family's north wall still isn't sealed properly." The Palmer cabin represented a common frontier approach to construction, built quickly with minimal preparation, intended to be improved over time as resources allowed. Court records from a later property dispute include testimony describing the structure: single-wall construction of green pine logs with basic saddle notching, minimal foundation work, and standard gable roof. chinking incomplete on north and west exposures due to early winter onset. Such compromises were typical among settlers racing against seasonal deadlines, prioritizing basic shelter over thorough construction. As November progressed, the consequences of hasty building became increasingly apparent throughout the valley. Church attendance records show declining numbers as families struggled with cold dwellings and the increasing effort required for basic survival. Reverend Williams's pastoral journal notes, "Many cabins never truly prepared for serious winter. Now families burn excessive wood trying to heat structures that cannot retain warmth. Already I'm hearing concerns about wood supplies lasting through February, and winter has barely begun." While others scrambled, Martha focused on interior details that puzzled observers. She installed a modified stove design with a masonry surround that extended to create a partial wall within the cabin. She incorporated air channels in this structure that connected to small vents near the floor and ceiling. When asked about this unusual feature, she reportedly replied, "Heat is just a resource to be managed like any other. Most people waste it." The system, as later analysis would reveal, created a convection current that distributed warmth throughout the cabin with remarkable efficiency. Martha's heating system drew from European masonry stove principles rarely seen in American frontier construction. The core concept involved thermal mass, using the stone surround to absorb heat during active burning, then radiating that heat gradually for hours after the fire had died down. Her innovation was adapting this approach to the limited materials available and the specific conditions of Montana winters. The air channels she incorporated functioned as a primitive heat exchanger, capturing waste heat from exhaust gases before they exited the chimney and distributing warmth throughout the structure. The efficiency of this system became increasingly critical as winter intensified. While traditional cabins required constant feeding of fires to maintain habitable temperatures, Martha's design achieved consistent warmth with significantly less fuel. Her notebooks document precise measurements of wood consumption. Standard design requires approximately 40 pounds of seasoned pine every 6 hours to maintain 50 degrees during cold periods. Modified system achieves same temperature with 15 pounds over 8 hours, while providing more even heat distribution. This efficiency would prove not merely convenient, but life-saving as the winter progressed. By December 1st, the situation in the valley had grown dire. 3 major storms had deposited over 4 feet of accumulated snow, with temperatures rarely rising above freezing. The limited road access to larger settlements was completely cut off. Denton's journal grows increasingly concerned. No mail delivery in 17 days. Supply wagon 2 weeks overdue. Palmer's youngest has developed a persistent cough in that drafty cabin. We've invited them to stay until repairs can be made, but that's 6 more mouths to feed from already strained supplies. Food preservation became a critical concern as winter deepened. Martha's preparations again demonstrated foresight that contrasted with frontier norms. While most settlers relied on basic cellars for food storage, she had constructed a specialized root cellar with multiple chambers that maintained different temperature and humidity levels. This design, sketched in her notebooks with detailed notes on optimal storage conditions for various foods, allowed for extended preservation of vegetables, smoked meats, and dairy products. Visiting neighbors reportedly expressed surprise at the systematic organization and abundance of her stores. Martha's approach to winter nutrition reflected scientific understanding uncommon in frontier settings. Her journals contained detailed notes on food combinations that would now be recognized as balanced nutritional planning. Maintaining strength through winter requires more than mere calories, she wrote. Each week's provisions must include preserved greens to prevent mouth sores and weakness, adequate fats for sustained energy, and varied proteins to maintain muscle strength during confined months. This approach contrasted with the often monotonous winter diets that contributed to health deterioration among isolated settlers. The true test of Martha's methods came during what would later be called the Christmas freeze of '87. From December 21st through January 2nd, temperatures plummeted to unprecedented lows. Fort Missoula recorded 42 degrees on December 26th, with sustained winds creating conditions that froze exposed skin in minutes. The settlement faced not just discomfort but genuine peril. Harmon's normally factual store ledger turns uncharacteristically emotional. The valley sounds different in this cold. The cracking of trees echoes like gunshots. 3 cabins have reported structural failures from the weight of ice and snow. Historical weather records confirm the exceptional nature of this cold snap. Meteorological data compiled by the Army Signal Corps show that December 1887 brought temperatures averaging 22 degrees below normal for the region, with the Christmas week representing the most extreme deviation. A report filed by Lieutenant Robert Winters described it as the most severe sustained cold observed since record-keeping began in the territory, noting that standard mercury thermometers froze solid, requiring alcohol-based instruments for accurate measurement. The extreme conditions created cascading problems throughout the valley. Church records indicate that regular services were suspended for 3 consecutive Sundays, an unprecedented break in community routine. Reverend Williams instead made limited visits to individual homesteads where possible, documenting alarming conditions. The Petersons' cabin shows 8 inches of snow inside from drift-through wall gaps. The Millers have burned furniture after exhausting accessible firewood. Fingers of frost extend inward from window frames in most dwellings I've entered. Martha's cabin, however, remained sound. The steep roof shed snow effectively, while her sealed logs showed none of the shrinkage gaps that plagued newer constructions. Most remarkably, her heating system maintained livable temperatures with significantly less fuel consumption. As wood supplies dwindled throughout the valley, this efficiency became critical. Denton, initially among her most vocal critics, was among the first to seek her advice. "Miss Stokes invited us in to witness her stove design," he wrote on January 3rd. "The difference is immediately apparent. My own cabin requires constant feeding of the fire, yet hers maintains heat with 1/3 the wood. The floor isn't cold underfoot, no drafts. She showed us how the masonry stores heat even when the fire dies down. I've been building cabins for 7 years and never considered such an approach." Denton's account highlights a critical aspect of frontier knowledge transmission. Traditional building methods persisted largely through generational habit rather than evaluated effectiveness. Martha's scientific approach, measuring outcomes, comparing alternatives, and implementing improvements, represented a fundamental shift in problem-solving methodology. Her willingness to question established practices, even when it invited ridicule, ultimately produced demonstrably superior results that even skeptics could not ignore when faced with the evidence. Word of Martha's successful adaptations spread quickly through the desperate community. Harmon's ledger notes a meeting held at his store on January 10th. Miss Stokes agreed to share her heating improvements. 17 men attended, despite brutal conditions, taking notes as she explained her masonry design using chalk diagrams. She demonstrated a temporary modification using available materials that might improve existing stoves. Several departed immediately to attempt these changes. The modifications Martha proposed for existing cabins revealed her practical understanding of crisis management. Rather than insisting on her complete system, impossible to implement midwinter, she developed simplified adaptations that could be achieved with limited resources. These included stone arrangements to increase thermal mass around existing stoves, draft control techniques to extend burn times, and simple heat reflectors that directed more warmth into living spaces. These stopgap measures, while less efficient than her integrated design, still significantly improved conditions in struggling households. By mid-January, Martha's cabin had become a crucial community resource. Her fuel-efficient design meant she could share her wood supplies with desperate neighbors. More importantly, she began teaching others her techniques for improvising repairs to their failing structures. Church records indicate she hosted an informal gathering where she demonstrated methods for sealing gaps and improving heat retention using available materials. Miss Stokes shared knowledge freely that could have been kept as advantage, noted Reverend Williams. Several families would likely not have survived without her instruction. This knowledge transfer extended beyond immediate crisis management. Martha developed illustrated instruction sheets for various improvements, carefully drawn to be understood by individuals with limited literacy. These documents, preserved in the Montana Historical Society collection, cover topics from chimney draft optimization to emergency insulation techniques using natural materials. The systematic presentation of this information, with clear illustrations, step-by-step instructions, and troubleshooting guidance, demonstrated her commitment to empowering others rather than merely showcasing her own superior preparations. The turning point in community perception came in February, when the Palmer cabin partially collapsed under accumulated ice. Martha immediately offered her space as refuge, while leading efforts to salvage the structure. Employing her pulley system and reinforcement techniques, she guided volunteers in stabilizing and repairing the damaged walls despite brutal conditions. She worked alongside men twice her size, showing no hesitation at the heaviest labor, wrote Williams. More importantly, she worked smarter. Her methods accomplished in 4 days what might otherwise have taken weeks. The Palmer cabin crisis illustrated the stark consequences of hasty construction versus methodical preparation. Court testimony from the subsequent insurance claim provides details of the failure. Progressive ice accumulation in the roof structure created uneven loading. This stress, combined with inadequate bracing and green timber shrinkage, caused catastrophic displacement of the north wall and partial roof collapse. The same document notes that other similar structures avoided failure only through continuous snow removal, an exhausting task that consumed valuable energy and exposed workers to dangerous conditions. Martha's repair approach demonstrated the same systematic thinking that characterized her original construction. Rather than attempting to rebuild the collapsed section immediately, she designed a temporary buttress system that stabilized the remaining structure. This allowed the Palmer family shelter while planning more permanent repairs. Her notes from this period include detailed structural analysis, identifying the failure points, and proposing reinforcement methods that would prevent similar issues in future winters. These recommendations, implemented when permanent repairs began in spring, were later credited with saving the rebuilt structure during the severe winter of 1889. As the community struggled through February, Martha's cabin became an impromptu educational center. On Sunday afternoons, when weather permitted, she hosted what locals called building clinics, where she demonstrated construction and heating techniques adaptable to existing structures. Attendance records kept by Reverend Williams show that 23 households, representing nearly the entire accessible community, participated in at least one session. The gender distribution is particularly notable, with women making up approximately 40% of attendees, an unusual pattern for construction-related gatherings in the era. The content of these sessions, recorded in notes taken by several participants, went beyond immediate winter survival. Martha introduced concepts of thermal efficiency, structural engineering principles, and material science in accessible terms. She explained why heat rises and how to capture it before it escapes through the roof, wrote Miller in his personal journal, showed how different woods burn at different rates and temperatures, made us understand the why behind the methods, not just the how. Never had schooling that made so much immediate sense. This educational approach represented Martha's most significant contribution to the community. Rather than creating dependency through charity or maintaining advantage through secrecy, she empowered others with knowledge that would serve them long after the immediate crisis passed. This pattern of knowledge sharing, unusual in an era when trade skills were often closely guarded, reflected a frontier ethic that valued community resilience over individual advantage, a philosophy Martha articulated in a journal entry from February 1888. Knowledge kept private may elevate one person for a season, Knowledge shared elevates an entire community for generations. As winter finally loosened its grip in late March, the full impact of Martha's innovation became clear. Fort Missoula's records confirmed it had been the harshest winter in recorded history for the territory. While neighboring settlements reported multiple casualties and abandoned homesteads, the Bitterroot community had persevered, largely due to shared knowledge that originated with Martha's techniques. The spring assessment of winter damage throughout the territory provides stark comparative data. Military supply reports from Fort Missoula document relief expeditions to several settlements where food shortages and dwelling failures had created desperate conditions. One report from Captain James Thornton describes finding an outlying community where 4 cabins stand abandoned, 2 show catastrophic structural failure, and surviving residents display signs of nutritional deficiency. This contrasts sharply with his assessment of the Bitterroot Valley. While hardships were evident, dwellings remain largely intact with ongoing repair work showing improved methods. No cases of severe deprivation observed. Martha's systematic approach to winter preparedness became the foundation for community planning. In April 1888, the newly formed Bitterroot Valley Improvement Association held its first meeting at the community church. Minutes preserved in county archives show Martha was unanimously elected technical advisor despite being ineligible for full membership as a woman. The association's first resolution established a construction standards committee charged with documenting improved building methods and creating guidelines for new settlers, essentially institutionalizing the knowledge Martha had introduced during the crisis. Spring brought researchers from the Montana Territorial University drawn by reports of the unusual construction methods. Professor Langley Wilson documented Martha's system in detail, later publishing findings in Practical Homesteading Improvements, 1889. His notes express particular admiration for her holistic approach. Miss Stokes's innovation lies not in any single technique, but in the systematic integration of methods from furniture joinery, masonry, and heat management adapted specifically to the constraints of solo construction and severe mountain conditions. Wilson's publication represented an important step in preserving and disseminating Martha's innovations. His technical analysis provided scientific validation for methods that some still dismissed as unorthodox. Detailed illustrations and precise measurements made the techniques accessible to builders throughout the territory. Most significantly, Wilson consistently credited Martha as the source of these improvements, unusual recognition for a woman's technical contributions in the era. This attribution ensured that her methods spread under her name rather than being absorbed anonymously into general practice. The academic documentation of Martha's work extended beyond construction techniques. Professor Wilson's colleague, botanist Eleanor Richards, conducted detailed studies of the specialized wood treatment formulations Martha had developed. Laboratory analysis confirmed the effectiveness of these mixtures in reducing moisture cycling and improving dimensional stability. Scientific validation of what practical experience had already demonstrated. Richards's findings, published in the American Journal of Forestry in 1890, introduced Martha's methods to a national audience of professionals beyond the frontier context. Martha's improved circumstances following the winter crisis reflected her enhanced status in the community. Store records from summer 1888 show her purchasing supplies for an expanded workshop adjacent to her cabin. This structure, detailed in building permits preserved in county archives, incorporated a dedicated space for teaching construction techniques to small groups. The permit application, submitted in Martha's precise handwriting, describes the building as a demonstration workshop for improved frontier construction methods, indicating her intention to formalize the educational role she had assumed during the emergency. This workshop became the center of Martha's evolving contribution to frontier development. Attendance logs from 1888-1892 show over 200 individuals receiving instruction in various aspects of her building system. The geographical distribution of these students is particularly notable, with participants traveling from settlements throughout western Montana and neighboring Idaho territory. This dissemination pattern explains the widespread adoption of Stokes methods documented in building records across the region during subsequent decades. The most revealing documents concerning Martha's methods were discovered during the restoration of the Bitterroot Historical Society building in 1962. A collection of her original notebooks, preserved in a tin box within a wall cavity, contained detailed drawings, calculations, and observations about wood properties, weather patterns, and heat dynamics. Most significant was a letter addressed to future builders, explicitly stating her intention to develop methods accessible to those working alone, particularly women seeking independence in the territories. "I designed this system," she wrote, "because I observed that traditional building methods require multiple strong bodies at crucial moments. This effectively excludes many capable people from self-sufficiency. I sought to replace brute force with mechanical advantage and hasty construction with proper preparation. What appears impossible is merely unfamiliar." This statement encapsulates Martha's most profound innovation, reconceptualizing frontier construction as an intellectual challenge rather than merely a test of physical strength. By applying scientific principles, careful planning, and appropriate technology, she transformed what had traditionally required a community effort into a task manageable by a single, determined individual. This philosophical shift, more than any specific technique, represented her most significant contribution to frontier development. The notebooks also revealed Martha's systematic documentation methodology. Each construction phase was recorded with precise measurements, material specifications, time requirements, and observed outcomes. Experimental variations were noted with scientific rigor, comparing results against clearly stated hypotheses. This approach, testing, measuring, and refining rather than simply following tradition, represented a fundamental shift in frontier problem-solving that extended far beyond construction techniques. Martha's influence continued to expand through formal publication. In 1891, she authored Single Handler's Guide to Mountain Construction, a comprehensive manual that synthesized her methods into a systematic approach accessible to individuals working without assistance. This modest volume, initially printed in a run of just 200 copies by a small press in Missoula, gained remarkable circulation throughout the mountain territories. Library acquisition records show copies reaching settlements throughout the northern Rockies, with several community lending programs reporting waiting lists for access. The guide's practical approach contributed to its influence. Rather than presenting abstract principles, Martha organized the content around specific challenges facing solo builders. Chapters address topics like raising walls without help, heat management for minimal fuel, and winter-ready construction in one season. Each section combined clear explanations with detailed illustrations and precise measurements, making the techniques accessible to individuals with limited technical background. This practical focus made the guide particularly valuable in remote areas where formal construction training was unavailable. Perhaps the most lasting testament to Martha's impact was the gradual incorporation of her techniques into local building practices. By 1895, county records show that over 40 structures in the region utilized variations of her wall assembly method. The Stokes stove design became a common feature in mountain homes throughout western Montana, with examples still functional in preserved historical buildings today. This adoption pattern reveals an important aspect of technical innovation diffusion in frontier settings. Rather than wholesale replacement of traditional methods, Martha's techniques were typically integrated into existing practices based on specific local needs and available materials. Building permits from the period show hybrid approaches that combined her wall-raising system with traditional joinery, or that incorporated her heating improvements into otherwise conventional structures. This selective adaptation pattern allowed her innovations to spread even among builders who might have rejected a complete departure from familiar methods. Martha's influence extended beyond physical construction to community development patterns. The success of her solo building approach made independent homesteading viable for individuals who would previously have required family or hired assistance. Census records from 1890 and 1900 show a significant increase in single-person households in regions where her methods had been adopted, with particular growth in properties registered to unmarried women. This demographic shift, while influenced by multiple factors, correlates strongly with the availability of construction techniques that enabled independent development. The social implications of this shift were significant. Traditional frontier development typically required extended family networks or hired labor, effectively limiting land ownership to those with existing resources or connections. Martha's system democratized the process, making independent homesteading viable for individuals with limited means but strong determination. This accessibility particularly benefited women seeking economic independence, minorities facing discrimination in traditional labor arrangements, and disabled individuals whose physical limitations had previously excluded them from independent construction. Martha's work attracted renewed attention during the economic challenges of the 1930s. As part of the Federal Writers Project documentation of American folk traditions, researcher Margaret Collins conducted extensive interviews with elderly residents of the Bitterroot Valley who remembered the winter of 1887-88. These oral histories, preserved in the Library of Congress collection, provide vivid personal accounts of Martha's impact. Recurring themes include the contrast between her methodical preparation and the community's initial skepticism, followed by the dramatic reversal of opinion when her methods proved life-saving during the crisis. These Depression-era interviews also reveal how Martha's approach had been incorporated into community wisdom. Elderly informants described passing her techniques to younger generations as essential survival knowledge, often with explicit attribution. That's a Stokes wall. You build it flat, then raise it whole. We call that a Stokes corner joint. Holds tight no matter how the temperature changes. Always build your stove the Stokes way if you want your wood to last the winter. This pattern of attribution, unusual for folk techniques that typically become anonymous over time, indicates the community's recognition of her specific contribution to regional building traditions. The cabin itself stood for nearly 70 years before being carefully dismantled in 1954 and reconstructed as part of the Frontier Heritage Museum in Missoula. Analysis during this process confirmed the exceptional quality of the joinery and the sophisticated engineering principles applied throughout the structure. Museum curator Samuel Reeves noted, "The remarkable aspect of Stokes's work is how she achieved complex results with simple tools through meticulous planning. Each log was cut specifically for its place in the overall structure, with joints that distribute load perfectly across the building." The dismantling process provided unprecedented opportunity to study Martha's construction methods in detail. Architectural historian Eleanor Peterson, who supervised the documentation, wrote, "The Stokes cabin represents an entirely different approach to frontier building than we typically encounter. Most structures from this period show improvisation, adjustment, and compromise. This building instead displays methodical execution of a thoroughly planned design. Each element interacts purposefully with others in a unified system that anticipates stresses and environmental challenges." Technical analysis revealed sophisticated engineering principles throughout the structure. The corner joints, for example, incorporated both mechanical interlocking and load distribution features that prevented the separation common in traditional designs during seasonal expansion and contraction. Wall sections included subtle curve compensations that accounted for anticipated settling, maintaining structural integrity over decades. Perhaps most remarkably, the roof design included calibrated ventilation features that prevented damaging condensation while minimizing heat loss, a problem that plagued many frontier structures but that Martha had evidently studied and solved. Modern engineering assessment conducted during the 1954 reconstruction confirmed the effectiveness of Martha's methods. Structural engineer William Henderson concluded, using only hand tools and locally available materials, Stokes achieved results that meet many aspects of modern building standards. Her approach to load distribution, thermal efficiency, and moisture management demonstrates intuitive understanding of principles that wouldn't be formalized in building codes for another 50 years. The structure's survival for 7 decades with minimal maintenance confirms the soundness of her methods. The cabin's reconstruction as a museum exhibit brought renewed public attention to Martha's innovations. Visitor records from the Frontier Heritage Museum show the Stokes cabin quickly became one of the most popular exhibits, with particular interest from engineering students, women's historical organizations, and practical builders seeking traditional methods. Museum education programs developed around the exhibit emphasized not just the physical techniques, but the problem-solving methodology that produced them: careful observation, systematic experimentation, and willingness to challenge convention when evidence supported better approaches. Martha Stokes remained in the Bitterroot Valley until her death in 1926 at the age of 78. She never sought recognition for her innovations, though she freely taught her methods to anyone who asked. Her quiet legacy lives on in building techniques still used in remote areas where prefabricated materials remain impractical, and in the broader principle her work embodied, that proper preparation and thoughtful design can overcome seemingly insurmountable limitations. County records track Martha's continued contribution to the community throughout her long residence. Building permits show her assisting with the design of the expanded community church in 1899, the new schoolhouse in 1904, and numerous private dwellings throughout the early 1900s. Her role evolved from practical builder to respected consultant, with particular focus on structures requiring special adaptations to mountain conditions. Even as conventional construction methods became more standardized with the arrival of the railroad and manufactured building materials, her specialized knowledge of local conditions and materials remained valuable. Martha's later years were characterized by continued education efforts rather than active construction. School board minutes from 1905-1915 document her regular presentations to students on topics ranging from basic structural principles to Montana-specific building considerations. These sessions, combining practical demonstrations with underlying scientific concepts, represented an early form of applied technical education rarely available to frontier communities. Several students influenced by these presentations later pursued formal engineering education, creating a generational extension of her impact. The personal dimensions of Martha's life remain somewhat obscure, reflecting the limited documentation of women's private experiences in frontier records. Census entries identify her consistently as single throughout her long residence, though community oral history suggests close friendships with several families. Church records show regular attendance and contributions to community activities, though rarely in leadership positions. What emerges is a portrait of a woman respected for specific technical expertise while maintaining a relatively private personal life, an unusual position for a woman in the frontier context. The winter of 1887-88 fades in living memory, but its lessons endure. Martha's approach demonstrated that frontier survival depended not on physical strength alone, but on foresight, systematic thinking, and willingness to challenge convention. Her story reminds us that true preparation means planning for the worst, while others hope for the best, and that knowledge shared becomes a community's strongest foundation. Perhaps most importantly, it teaches that innovation often comes from those working at the margins, solving problems that others have the luxury of avoiding through privilege or circumstance. This pattern of innovation from necessity recurs throughout frontier history. Individuals excluded from traditional power structures, whether by gender, ethnicity, physical capability, or economic status, frequently developed alternative approaches that proved valuable precisely because they couldn't rely on conventional resources. Martha's building system represents a quintessential example of this pattern. Denied access to the communal labor that traditional methods required, she developed an approach that transformed limitation into advantage through intellectual rather than physical resources. The rediscovery of Martha's notebooks during the 1962 restoration provided the most complete picture of her philosophical approach. Among technical drawings and material specifications, she included reflective passages that revealed her systematic thinking. Proper preparation eliminates crisis. The time to solve winter problems is summer. The moment to address structural weaknesses is before assembly. What appears to others as excessive caution is simply problems solved in advance when solutions are still possible. This preventive approach contrasted sharply with the reactive pattern common among frontier settlers. Limited resources often led to prioritizing immediate needs over long-term security, creating vulnerability to predictable challenges. Martha's innovation was recognizing that thorough planning and methodical execution, investing time rather than materials, could achieve security even with limited physical resources. This shift from reactive to preventive thinking represented a fundamental advancement in frontier adaptation strategies. The educational dimension of Martha's legacy deserves particular emphasis. Rather than keeping her innovations as personal advantage, she systematically documented and disseminated them through multiple channels: informal teaching, structured workshops, published guides, and institutional records. This commitment to knowledge transfer ensured that her methods outlived her personal practice, becoming embedded in regional building traditions that benefited generations beyond her direct contact. In the words Professor Wilson concluded his study, Miss Stokes's contribution extends beyond mere construction technique. She has demonstrated that frontier resilience lies not in conquering nature through force, but in understanding and working harmoniously with its patterns. Her methodology transforms isolation from vulnerability into opportunity for innovation. Future generations would be wise to remember that preparation is never wasted time, and that true mastery often appears as simplicity to those who fail to recognize the thought behind it. Martha's legacy continues in both tangible and philosophical dimensions. The physical techniques she developed, her joinery system, thermal efficiency approaches, and solo construction methods remain relevant in contexts where industrial building materials are unavailable or unsuitable. More fundamentally, her systematic approach to problem-solving, careful observation, methodical experimentation, and evidence-based improvement offers a model applicable far beyond construction. Perhaps most significantly, her story demonstrates how limitations, when approached with creativity rather than resignation, can spark innovations that benefit entire communities. The winter that tested Martha's methods has long since passed into history, but the principles she embodied remain timeless. Thorough preparation trumps hasty reaction. Understanding natural patterns allows working with rather than against them. Knowledge shared multiplies rather than diminishes its value. And seemingly impossible challenges often require not greater strength, but more thoughtful approaches. In this way, the woman who built an impossible cabin alone left a blueprint not just for frontier structures, but for resilient communities built on shared knowledge and mutual support.